Today is November 18th, 1974, and I'm interviewing Mr. James Rייס in Chicago, Illinois.
Recall what events which are now almost get all the details straight. My recollection of working with Chaplain Eli Bowman is that very quickly we discovered that we had similar aims and similar problems, and we became an informal team from almost from the outset of my arrival.
Do you remember when that was?
I came to Salzburg in August of 1945. I had come via France and Italy, and there was an office of the JDC in Salzburg at that time, but no American was there. The only American was a man by the name of Ruben Resnick, R-E-S-N-I-K, who was in Vienna, and to whom I reported temporarily until he, I think, returned to New York City. Bowman was attached to the 82nd Division, who was in charge of the displaced persons. So we were working together both with the displaced persons in the camps and their committees, which was a highly complicated thing in itself. And we both had to learn a good deal about working with the people who had been through this incredible experience and survived it, as well as the different mores and culture of Eastern European Jews. In addition to that, we had the official responsibility of working with the authorities. You had both the Army and UNRWA at that time. It became evident from the outset that UNRWA, although we of JDC had some attachment to UNRWA officially, was not very influential as compared with the Army. Because you have to remember, this was only a few weeks after the end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the Army was dismantling and demobilizing, they still ruled the roost in Austria as well as Germany. And if you wanted to get something done, you had to work with the Army. So that was great for Chaplain Bowman. He had easy access to the top officers. And as a matter of fact, I think it was partly with his help that I developed my own contacts with the top Army people.
Well, that's an important point.
Yes.
I just want to stop you for a second.
Yes.
Because many of the chaplains felt that throughout the period,
Yes.
they were the ones who were able to get to the top generals, etc., the officers, whereas the JDC people themselves had to generally go through them. But you said now that with Chaplain Bowman,
Yes.
he was able to introduce you and facilitate some of these introductions.
Yes.
But that in the end you were working, you didn't have to go through Bowman to get...
No, not at all. But we always worked together. There was certainly no sense of competition. Quite the contrary. We were instinctively partners in this job. There was so much to do that there was no place for anybody trying to, run the show. And I think that was fortunate that was the case. As you recall, in Bauer's book, I described my own direct contacts with the Army officials that went right up to General Clark. It was that famous meeting that he called that's described here, and Chaplain Bowman was there too.
Right.
And we were assigned together with General Hume as a team of 3 people, Hume, Bowman, and myself, given authority to get the Jewish DPs out of the very bad camps that in which they've been placed into good quarters. And that's one of the interesting things. I don't remember whether I described that or whether Bauer described in his book what happened. But when that meeting was called in Clark's office in Vienna very suddenly, to which I was invited, Bonin, and a English-speaking representative of the DPs, the decision was made to turn over very good living quarters to the Jews. Well, we were the team to go to the Jews and explain this wonderful news to them. But when Bonin and I went into the camps and talked to the committee, they weren't going to move. At the time, it was kind of a shock to us, but we quickly understood the reasons for it. Some were, I would say, because of their past experience. Every time they moved from one place to another, no one knew what was going to happen. And even though they were safe now, and the U.S. Army was there, and here was an American rabbi, and here was an American social worker representing an American Jewish organization, still, they didn't know what the place was going to be. And there were other reasons. The committees had quickly set up their own organizations, their own relationships with the displaced persons. They were in charge of distributing supplies, and they had certain jobs and so on. It was, you know, somewhat of a political organization. And to move to an entirely new setting would throw everything out of gear. So they were a little afraid of this change. So we took them around to show them what they were going to get, and they were quite remarkable facilities. One was a rather decent, for that period, workers' housing project, and they actually moved Austrian citizens out of these apartments to create a place for the Jews to live. That was a place that became the camp known as New Palestine. Oh. And the other was the fantastically attractive and even luxurious resort Bad Gastein, where many hotels were turned over for the residence of the Jews. That's not such a famous resort now, and I don't understand why, because it's a beautiful place. There's a waterfall that comes down from the high mountains that falls over the village. You know, it's a unique phenomenon. And in the pre-World War II days, people such as President Roosevelt's mother used to go there for her summer vacations. At any rate, the Germans had used it for housing the wives and children of high officers. So you can see it was a very nice and very secluded place. Well, at any rate, as I recall, Chaplain Bone and I went to see the place, and we took with us some of the displaced persons representatives. Once they saw it, it was such an attractive place that they agreed to eventually persuade everybody to move down there. And they did. It became, it was one of the stations on the illegal immigration eventually, because it had a choice location in that respect. It was on the Austrian-Italian, well, near the Austrian-Italian border, although it was inside Austria. So people who came in there could quietly and secretly be moved across the mountains into Italy on their way to catch a boat to go to Israel. That became a well-run operation, and Chaplain Bona and I visited fairly often. I remember before that, too, one of the things that distressed both of us was, this is not such a pleasant aspect of the story, that by contrast with the other displaced persons, the non-Jewish displaced persons, the camps of the Jews were very unkempt. And of course that was constantly criticized by the army, perhaps with tinges of anti-Semitism. You see, this is how the Jews live. And we were constantly remonstrating with the camp committees asking them to improve the camps, not just because it was criticized by the Army, but because it really was unpleasant to see and probably unhealthy. But their attitude about it was, well, we have suffered in concentration camps, and we had to do the most incredible things, and now that we're out, we just don't want to do any of this, and unless somebody, does it for us. Well, that, of course, that changed as time passed in a matter of a few weeks, or maximum a few months. And these new places where they were put in New Palestine, the apartment house in Bad Gastein, that was not a serious problem, except perhaps overcrowding from time to time. Well, another interesting thing I remember that Bonin and I both started separately was a package program. Because you remember, after the war, of course, there was tremendous scarcity of any supplies, food or clothing, and JDC, as powerful as an organization as it was, had financial resources. They were limited, but they couldn't produce the supplies even if they had the money in the United States. There was the problem of buying them, the problem of shipping them and distributing.
Why couldn't they have shipped them through JWB?
Oh, not in the tremendous quantities that were needed. We're talking about what eventually became hundreds, thousands of tons of supplies is what was really needed. And that became true in subsequent years. I'm talking now about the summer of 45 and the early part of 46, which incidentally was a bitter winter, that 1945, 46. So there were two things we were able to do. One, this was where our connections were important with the Army, supplies from the Army. They were the ones who had everything.
Right. Now, could you, as a JDC worker, been able to get supplies on your own, or was it... In other words, I'm trying to find out the uniqueness of the position of the chaplain.
Yes, I understand. Well, it's hard to pinpoint, 3 decades later, exactly how Eli Bonin and I worked together on this. I certainly had my own contacts with the Army, with top officials.
When you first arrived?
No, not when I first arrived. It took.
Well,
from August, it took maybe until this incident, which is described in the book, when Clark laid down the law that he wanted things to be done right, and Bonin and I were part of the team. That took a couple of months. After that, we really had free access, either one of us, to pick up a phone and ask for something. They, in principle, they should give it to you, with all the problems that you run into in bureaucracy.
So then, if that's the case, then you really did need a chaplain in the area.
No, I wouldn't say that. On the contrary, first of all, I was one man for many months.
Okay, yeah.
Secondly, I was running an operation outside of the Army. I had my own office and staff. He was right in the Army headquarters, so he had, if I called him to ask for something, he could do something right away before I would have to go over to the Army headquarters.
So there are certain things, could you be specific?
Well, it's hard to remember now exactly what my recollection is, that if we heard that a new group of refugees had arrived in New Palestine and there weren't enough beds or enough blankets, that together we would, try to reach the right person in the Army and get the stuff delivered and taken care of. And then there were problems with the committee. I described one of them. There were constant problems because, as anyone knows who works with Jewish organizations, Jews have their own ideas, and we were the liaison in our own ways, perhaps different, perhaps overlapping, with the Army, who might be complaining about something. I explained this one area, but in other respects too. But what I started to say about supplies was how we worked cooperatively. Here we were at the start of a winter with really a shortage of supplies.
Winter of 1945.
45, 46, right. It's true, the essential things were provided by the Army, but they were a minimum. And with the constant change in the numbers of people, there was always a shortage, because if you had blankets that they were sending out a few truckloads in the night,
on their way to Italy, they took blankets with them, so there'd be shortage, and they used blankets to make clothes and so on. Also, there's certain kinds of food they missed that the Army couldn't give them. And what each of us decided to do, and other chaplains were doing it as well throughout Germany and Austria, was write home to our congregations and our families and say, send packages through the APO, through the Army Post Office. And I must tell you that our JDC headquarters reacted the way bureaucrats usually do. They disapproved of it. They didn't think it would do any good, and it would just, be kind of a petty retail sort of business. But they were wrong. It developed into a tremendous program. And it was also a thing that the American Jewish community wanted to do. Here was I in Austria. The family identified with the problem of the Jews, and the husband and father who was away. Eli Bonin was in exactly the same position. So when you wrote back and said, here's something you can do, start packing canned goods, start sending clothing, and send it through the APO, they organized teams of people in the congregation. My wife mobilized her friends to do this, and we got a big stream of supplies coming, which really, helped in specific things. The Army, for example, didn't have children's clothes or baby food, and these were some of the things that came through it. And then the JDC, having seen what was happening, I'm not talking just about Chaplain Bonin or Jim Rice, but the same phenomenon was going on elsewhere, decided that was a way to do business, and they set up a big operation called SOS, Save Overseas Survivors.
When did this take place?
That began, I would guess, in late 46 or 47. Even then, you see, there were some shortages of supplies in the United States. And until the American industrial machine converted to civilian production, these used things that people could send were very important. Later, of course, and you could buy new things, and the program was dropped because displaced persons themselves preferred to have new things. Sometimes hard to understand, that poor people, they should take your cast-off clothes, but nobody really likes it. But that program was really quite a remarkable thing, which the chaplains developed. We were part of it, but there was no doubt that the chaplains played a bigger role because they had a whole congregation to turn to on this. I can't remember now the details of how those things were warehoused and distributed, but
in certain places, the chaplains would get the material and then work hand in hand with JDC.
Yes.
With warehouses.
Yes,
in other words,
that's my recollection of it. And incidentally, of course, it included religious material, too, which obviously the Army didn't have, and the Jews wanted desperately. Taliesim and books and all kinds of religious things were sent by this method. Later on, you had, here the chaplains played a role, too. You had factories to produce them among the DPs. The religious Jews took on that responsibility.
Could you give me some examples of that, if you remember?
Well, they made Seder plates.
No, I mean, how was this set up, in other words?
Well, the JDC would provide the funds for a workshop and, get the supplies either from the civilian economy or through the Army, however it was possible to do. And the chaplains would work with such rabbis as survived among the DPs. There were obviously few and far between that were among the first to be killed, to decide what was needed and supervise the production to make sure that it followed all the necessary religious requirements. That was part of, it was also a vocational rehabilitation process. It kept
people from being idle in the camps. That was one of the tragedies of camp life, that people do nothing, and it's demoralizing, especially during that period from 45 through 1948, before the State of Israel came into existence, and the only way to leave the camp was by this illegal method, which was dangerous and often didn't succeed. So here were people in the camp, you had to do something. And there were hort workshops too. I mean, that has nothing directly to do with chaplains. But I think the role of the chaplains too, I've described some very specific things, was interpreting to the Army, especially the top officers, the problems of the Jews. First of all, I think it's fair to say that we've seen a recent evidence of it. There's anti-Semitism among, these born and bred Army officers, and you had to combat that. And there was ignorance. It was a special, very complicated problem of handling the Jews. And the Jews, of course, could be obstreperous and difficult too. They were much less docile in that respect than the other displaced persons, the so-called slave labor from Eastern Europe. Where did we leave off?
To the chaplain interpreter.
Yes, that was a very key role. We did it to a certain extent also, of course, because I described my own contacts with the Army officials, so it was you were constantly, don't forget this was the period of tremendous turmoil about whether or not Israel could be declared as a homeland for the Jews. And so it was newspapers, including the Army issues, the Army papers. So this, I think, was a key responsibility. In Austria, particularly, we had this very unique relationship as a result of that order that Clark gave in October of 1940. Came in after Clark relieved the other general from his duties because of his failure to take proper care of the Jews. The new general asked me to appoint somebody who would have the office next to him as his Jewish advisor on problems of DPs. And we had a staff member whose office was right in the Army headquarters there.
It was a member of the JDC.
That was a member of the JDC, yes. And not the chaplain, of course, already had access.
But why did
the chaplain was not an operating agency? He was an officer,
right,
theoretically, to serve the Jews in the military.
Right.
In Austria, about accepting the chaplain, as I've explained, as also one of the advisors on Jewish affairs. But he wasn't an agency. The JDC, as it began, operating agency with the staff. We had, of course, we employed local staff too. That was from the beginning. They were available, English-speaking DPs, gave them a job, and they understood the problems. So you had a staff, you had eventually resources, we had money to pay people or pay for special projects. Things that the displaced persons asked for, and the Jews talked with Eli Bonin about it and confessed to him that as a Jew brought up in the Reform movement, I had never seen a mikveh. So he explained what it was all about, and of course I gave him the money to provide it. And eventually I went to see it, and I recall that incident as saying that...
Do you remember when this was?
Well, this was in the late fall of 45, early 1946, that I was in the unique position of having provided funds for a mikveh before I ever saw one in my life. I'm just using it as an illustration of how there is a differing function. The main one being that the chaplain, of course, had access to the Army's great resources in manpower and supplies to the extent one could get them by various means.
But still, as JDC began to expand its operations, it was clear that this was, a major relief organization.
Mm-hmm. At what point would you say, was there any point where it would seem to me that the chaplain's role was primary during the early part? Was there any point when the JDC role became more prominent?
Well, I think that came about gradually, just as I was saying, because...
But where the chaplain was very...
you mean limited and reduced in his responsibility?
Right.
Well, first, I have to remind you, I stayed in Austria only until the spring of 1946.
Right.
And at that time, the chaplain was still very important. I would guess, because after all, I knew what was going on. I remained in the JDC in Europe and other assignments, that the chaplain remained important, certainly right up to the Declaration of Israel as a state in May of '48, and in the period immediately after, because you had this tremendous emptying out of the camps in the weeks that followed Israel's declaration of independence. So it probably, their importance, I imagine, declined as far as this problem is concerned by the end of '48, early '49. Incidentally, just for the record, Jews were going elsewhere than to Israel. Well, the doors of the U.S. were closed at first, too. That was a terrible frustration, but things were happening in the United States. They began so-called President Truman's directive in the fall of '46, permitted Jews to come to the United States. And the chaplains were involved in that kind of thing also, because it was a humanitarian problem. Somebody would write to the chaplain, can you find my cousin? He's in such and such a place, and help him to come to Chicago or Cleveland or whatever it was. So they worked very closely with the JDC offices on matters of that kind, too. Those are things I remember best. I wish that I did more extensive notes, or had access, perhaps, to my reports in the JDC. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at those things.
Well, I tend to. I've seen some reports.
Yeah. No matter how many of those things they've kept from those days, I hope they have kept them. But,
of all the Jewish organizations, they're one of them that keeps very extensive files.
Yeah, that's good.
Was there anything else on the package program that you wanted to mention?
No, I think I've given you the details of it.
What about working within the camps themselves with the chaplains?
Well, they were in the camps a great deal of the time. They spent a lot of their time in the camps. I'd say even more than I did. In a sense, I had more administrative responsibilities, running an organization, answering telephones from our Paris headquarters, making sure we got, supplies that finally were in the pipeline delivered. So I would guess that in that respect, Chaplain Bonin, for example, spent more time with the displaced persons at camp and knew them perhaps better even than I did. Lots of times we went together, but he must have spent, I guess, 75% of his time working on DP problems, and the rest, his military responsibility. I shouldn't minimize those too much, because that time there were plenty of Jewish GIs in the Army, and it was important for him to carry on religious services and the other counseling duties of chaplains. Quite incidentally, another thing he did, quite obviously, was help enlist Jewish GIs in the programs.
Which you might not have been able to do.
Right, both officially and unofficially. That is the things that the Army assigned them to, and things that they did on their own. And not only there were not only Jews involved. There were some very devoted and decent non-Jewish GIs and officers who saw the plight of the Jews and helped in every way, officially and unofficially. And these guys worked with both Bonin and myself.
Well, what do you think would have happened had there not been a chaplain, like Rabbi Bonin or others?
Well, I think the situation would have been much worse because the Army, couldn't, at the beginning at least, regard this as a major responsibility. They had done their job, in licking the Nazis, and the main thing on their mind was to get the hell out. You remember how quickly we demobilized after the war, and it needed constant reminders and interpretation of the problems of the Jews to get enough attention on this. There was pressure from home, to be sure, if you will, the Jewish community talking to the government and congressmen and so on who came through and were interested. But without the chaplains, I think the plight of many of the Jews would have been much worse. I don't know that their presence or lack of presence would have, actually changed history radically. Don't know that what I did actually changed it. There were big forces going on. The surviving Jews, under the leadership of the Jews from Palestine, were going to get the state of Israel. That was, I think, inevitable under the circumstances. But it might have been harder and slower, and maybe people, and some people survived wouldn't have because they were helped to mobilize various kinds of resources for them. It was good for the morale too of the displaced persons to have both groups there. The JDC representing, the Joint. The Joint that had its great name in Eastern Europe ever since the World War I, and to have American rabbis as symbols of the strength of the American Jewish community, especially because so few rabbis survived the concentration camps. They were a priority on the death list, just like any leader was killed off first. So it supplied need, religious and psychological need, I think.
Were you involved in Aliyah Bet with the chaplains?
Well, I was very deeply involved in Aliyah Bet. I don't recall just offhand what role the chaplains played, other than the obvious fact that everything important was going on, and that was terribly important. We worked together. So
was this a unique relationship that you had with Chaplain Bonin? Did other JDC workers, to the best of your knowledge, have this type of working relationship?
Yes, I'm quite sure they did. I remember visiting, Salzburg is not far from Munich, which was the headquarters for the American zone of Germany. And I remember visiting there for meetings, and the chaplains had the same intimate kind of relationship with JDC that Bonin and I did. It just was a natural kind of relationship. There may have been some rare exceptions, if there were some clash of personalities, but I don't even know of any. They saw in each other allies, and
you needed them, they needed you.
Yeah. Well, the problem needed both of us.
Right.
And while that was our main task, the chaplains had other official assignments. The nature of the problem was such that I think we had put it this way, I think we had a closer relationship with the Army and a more effective relationship in getting things done for the DPs in Austria than was true in Germany. I say we, meaning Bonin and myself and the others for the JDC. That was partly due to this direct interest that Clark took in the matter, but also because the problem was smaller. See, it was a many times larger problem in Germany, and when a problem gets bigger, then it's harder to have this kind of close working relationship. But I can't, speak too intimate detail what happened in Germany during that same period. And it's nevertheless true the chaplains were part of the team that worked together on this. remember one particular chaplain, Klausner, who was in Germany, deeply involved with the staff.
Abraham Klausner.
Abraham Klausner. Where is he? In
Yonkers.
Yonkers, yes. I can still see him. At that time, he was a very thin, gaunt-looking man, heavy beard. That was, he shaved. Beards weren't stylish then, but he was a kind of volatile personality, as you may know. I don't know what he's like today, and there were often differences of opinion between him and the JDC staff.
Do you remember any particular incidents?
No, I don't. But if you haven't interviewed Sam Haber, who was the present head of JDC, the executive vice chairman, he was the guy who was running the program at that time. And another man who's interesting is who preceded Sam in that job, a fellow named Levi Becker.
Right. He's in Montreal.
Montreal, the top community leader. Very interesting man. There's another person who worked in Austria who's now in Miami by the name of Leon Fisher. He's the head of the Jewish Family Service in Miami, Florida. FISHER. Yes, he came in as part of my staff shortly after I left.
It's Miami Beach?
Yeah, or I don't know, Miami Beach maybe. And then he worked for Hayes, also in Italy. He's, interestingly enough, he's active with refugees now. Soviet Jews coming into the States, so there are a lot of them going to Miami. Key people.
Yes,
He and Sam are brothers.
Isn't it? At Ann Arbor, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He's retired. He has nothing to do with university at this point.
Yes, he does. He's retired from that job as dean, but he has some kind of post in the university.
Might be
He
helpful.
might be able to tell you something about it.
Yeah.
Browdy would be a very good person to talk to. Now, Browdy has its 60th annual meeting in New York next month. And Browdy often comes in for those meetings. And he'd be a good person to talk to from the standpoint of a chaplain, especially one who stayed in this work all these years. If I were, writing an article or recording that period, I would say they played a very key role, no question about it. And it was an unexpected and historic use of a resource which nobody thought about when, just by the fact that our military calls for chaplains of all faiths. The rabbis assigned to that purpose were on the job to help. Of course, I tell you this from my personal experience and my observation what went on in Germany, which is more limited.
When were you in Germany?
Well, I was never, I won't say I was never signed there, that's another story. But during this period we're discussing, which is 1945, 46, I went to Germany only for occasional meetings in Germany as the director there for about a year and a half. That was the period when the DP camps were finally being closed down. The difficult cases had been concentrated in one camp outside of Munich. I don't the responsibility of the chaplains to explain to the officers. They could stop it theoretically. They could stop it at the borders. They could go to a camp and say you can't admit new people, and you had to constantly fight that battle to explain why things shouldn't be stopped, couldn't be stopped.
Now, do you know anything about the activity of various chaplains to send guns and money to Palestine?
No.
You never heard of any?
I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it myself. I really don't. I'm not just
No, I
climbing up
understand.
because I just had no direct knowledge of it. I don't think Bonin had anything, was any way involved in it, but maybe he was. I have no impression.
But there were rumors to that effect at the time.
I've heard them, yes.
Did you know anybody who was rumored to be involved with this?
No. Remember, Austria was somewhat isolated, well, I think I know what went on there, and I don't know of any such activity. It may have gone on as a well-kept secret for me. I just don't know of anything like that in Germany. Other people know of anything. I do know that the young people, the teenagers and young 20-year-old Jews in the camps were training. That was an open secret. My understanding was, they were using broomsticks instead of guns. But I do not know my own personal knowledge, or even of any rumors that I now remember, at least, that any military supplies were going out of Austria for that purpose. I'm sure something of the sort went on. After all, it's always easy enough to persuade somebody to sell you a gun or something. But I don't recall that exactly.
Now, what about the relationship between the chaplains and the Jewish agency and UNRWA? Do you remember anything about that that might be of importance?
No, nothing in particular. We were all involved in that sort of bureaucratic situation. No, I can't think of anything specific in that respect.
Okay. Was there anything else that you wanted to add before we finish?
No. I think I've given you what I best remember.
Okay, fine. Thank you.